I'm delighted to be here with you this morning and delighted to introduce Jerry Pinkney. Jerry grew up in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and as a child he struggled to read, the result of dyslexia, which was not diagnosed until he was in his 40s. But early on, he discovered that his ability to draw offered him another avenue for achievement, both in school and in his professional life. He attended the Philadelphia Museum College of Art on full scholarship and went on to become a successful freelance graphic artist and commercial illustrator. In the 1960s, Jerry was actively involved in the civil rights movement and worked on projects that promoted African American culture and heritage. This led him, in 1964, to illustrate his first children's book, The Adventures of Spider, West African Folktales Retold by Joyce Arkhurst. It proved a harbinger of the pictures he'd create for a rich variety of fairy tales, folk tales, legends, and fables. For some of these books, such as Tonweya and the Eagles by Rosebud Yellowrobe, he immersed himself in the history, culture, and art of other peoples and countries. For others, such as Little Red Riding Hood, he adapted the text and created pictures to convey the African American experience in the US. And for still others, such as The Lion and the Mouse and the Three Billy Goats Gruff, he demonstrated an amazing ability to generate realistic-looking animals that also projected the nuances of human emotions. But Jerry has never limited himself to one genre. Over the past 56 years, he has also illustrated a rich array of poetry, nursery rhymes, and songs, such as God Bless the Child by Billie Holiday and Arthur Herzog Jr., historical and contemporary fiction, such as In Plain Sight by Richard Jackson, and biography and nonfiction, such as Sweethearts of Rhythm, the story of the greatest all-girl swing band by Marilyn Nelson. The diversity of Jerry's work is truly impressive, but I would say there are two significant elements that unite his books. The first element is his mastery of his technique and medium. He has illustrated memorable books using pencil and graphite, but he's best known for his intricately detailed, finely textured, full-color art created with pencil, colored pencil, and watercolor, to which he sometimes adds collaged elements, as he did most recently in A Place to Land, Martin Luther King Jr. and the Speech That Inspired a Nation by Barry Wittenstein. The second element is his commitment to narrative art, the power of storytelling through pictures. Look carefully at his illustrations, and you will see that nothing sits flatly on the page. The pacing and layout of each spread encourages the next page turn. And at the same time, there are narrative elements in the art that are not present in the plot, in the story, but are meant to be discovered on second and third reading. As Jerry himself once stated, "I love the act of making marks on paper and seeing those marks develop into a picture. How rewarding it is just to sit, observe, and paint. But I am a storyteller at heart, which is why I was drawn to picture books. There is something special about knowing that your stories can alter the way people see the world and their place within it." I'm sure you understand this philosophy. Jerry has received all the major US awards and accolades for children's book illustration, and he's been honored with several Lifetime Achievement Awards for his substantial and lasting contribution to the field. Truly, if I read a complete list of all these tributes to you, starting with his Caldecott Medal and 5 Caldecott honors, and including all the titles designated as notable books, it would take up half the time set aside for Lessons from a Legend. So be sure you get one of the handouts we've provided that detail a selection of his key honors and awards. And now, please join me in welcoming Jerry Pinkney to the SCBWI 2020 Midwinter Conference. I got to the end and then I blew it. We get there. Well, let's welcome him.
And I have to say, Marcia, you can read my introduction at any time. The tone of her voice, isn't that magical? Yeah, I mean, it's like storytelling in itself. Okay.
I love
Yeah,
that. Thank you.
right.
So we're going to start, as Laurent mentioned, with a conversation. And from there, you'll have a chance to see Jerry's process and then actually see him do work in person with an overhead camera. So this part is just to kind of have a conversation between the two of us that we hope you'll be interested in as well. Starting at the beginning, which is what gets you started with a project? What motivates you to take on a project?
Well, most of my projects, first of all, there's a call from a publisher, an editor, and with the possibility they have a text that they think that I would be the right fit for. That's most of the time. So that the actual text itself is the springboard. That's where the energy first. It's that first read. In the projects that I create on my own, that I initiate, it starts with, and we'll probably get into this sense of what I can bring back or call back from my childhood that actually sparks a idea. For instance, the stories that I was read to or told when I was growing up. So you'll see that it's two-pronged in many ways. It's the working and collaborating with an author, one, and secondly, those stories that I create and initiate on my own. And they just spring right out of my childhood and my fascination as a kid growing up with storytelling, whether it was folk tales, which were actually told, which I think that the energy in my work comes from the remembrance of how those stories were served up when I was growing up. And each day or each story told over and over and over again would have a new energy depending on the mood of the storyteller or who that storyteller might be. So when I reach back in terms of what I want my pictures to feel like, it really is that person that's standing in front of you who is telling a story and injecting into that stew parts of themselves. So that is what that's what I strive for.
So do you hear the voice when it's not your own story? Do you hear the voice in your head that you're reading? Do you interact with that with the author at all, or is it presented to you and you are to go ahead with it as you see it, as you read it?
Well, it's a combination of a lot of things. It's certainly the voice of the text. And that's in place. And then I look for that certain something that I can respond to personally. That is really key. There has to be a reason for the investment. And that comes out of, I remember this experience that it can relate, or even like reference that I've gone through and maybe put aside. And now I have a use for it. It stays in the back of your mind, and now all of a sudden I have a use for it. So what I hope for, is that what gets me started changes with that text or with the story idea, and with the day or the year or what am I going through. So it has to, you think about a person sits in the studio and with his materials and tools around them, in isolation, why am I doing this?
So it has to speak to you.
It has to speak to me, and I have to believe that there's some part of me that I'm sharing, even when the text is generated by someone else.
And when you do this, is it a way you take on a familiar story? We have all these wonderful classic folk and fairy tales that we've all grown up with, and yet your presentation is very much a part of your life and how, do you see that in the beginning, or do you hear it? Is it part of your process to adjust right from the beginning, or is it part of the development?
It starts, my mother loved to read, so it started always with her voice. And it also speaks to the time I grew up. I was born in 1939, growing up in the 40s in Philadelphia. It was segregated, de facto segregated at the time. So there was limits actually to where I could go or felt I was welcome. But there was something powerful about having stories served up, you know, by my mother who loved Hans Christian Andersen and Aesop's Fables. And then you would have a story like John Henry that was told, or the Uncle Remus tales. So that, I mean, that runs through all of my work. So I call up that experience and how I was moved by story. And, you know, when I was a kid growing up, there wasn't, first of all, we had very few books in the house. And most of the books that we had, they were, you know, like Hans Christian Andersen, there were, you know, a collection of stories, which were maybe illustrated in black and white. So I say, and maybe it's true, but you know, you get to a certain age when you start bringing up things, you kind of thread the needle a lot of times, that my mind was, you know, developing in my head these characters. But you have to remember, I came from a very limited world at the time. A limited world that expanded my creativity because we had to fill that time with something. So, and what we had was our imaginations.
Yes, yes. And on the other side, I want to talk about how you develop your project, but are there occasions when you've turned down something, when it doesn't speak to you? I know for a lot of beginning artists, they feel they don't have the luxury to say no to something because this is a chance to get published. But the controversy with that, or the difficulty with that, is if it truly doesn't speak to you, how do you illustrate it? So are there projects that you've just said, no, this is not for me?
In the very beginning, I took every project. It was a means of providing for a family. I was 20 years old. I had 4 kids, a wife and 4 kids. So what I did, though, and this is very interesting, and I hope this ties into what you said, because I came from a different space and different time. My landscape was that I had to provide for a family, and I wanted to use this gift as a way of doing it. So by the way, I was a design major, a graphic design major at the Philadelphia Museum College. I didn't study illustration, and it was a pragmatic decision. I loved to draw and drew all the time as a kid growing up. But with my father, who supported me in many, many ways, when it came to, well, this is a familiar story, it came to going to art school, he said, no way. And, but my mother was, you know, that wind behind my back. So I came from a place where drawing was a necessity. It was a safety net. So was making a living. So I had to contrive my day around passion and that pragmatic side. So, so I was very disciplined. I worked whatever I had to do from 9 to 5, and then from whatever in the weekends I did books. That was the need. That was the passion. So now there was a lot that came out of there. There was a discipline, a meeting a deadline. So I did, and you can see my career. You can see where it's advertising first, and always doing books. My first book, hey, by the way, 1964, it's still in print. But it was a matter of figuring out if bookmaking was what I wanted to do and had a passion for, then I had to figure out how I was going to do it. And so it went from doing advertising and a little bit of institutional work, books kind of on the side, but that was the passion. That was what I couldn't wait to do. And then eventually teaching. I put teaching in place, went to my agent and said, okay, no advertising for 6 months, went back and said a year. And you can see with the Morandian brother, Winn, was when I started teaching. You see the compositions get more developed, you see more time invested, and then eventually I was getting at a point where I could, you know, I mean, in the very beginning there was no dedicated space in bookstores. There was no opportunity, with the exception of libraries. So, and then that was federally funded, and that, and all of a sudden that went away. And we were looking for ways, so I had to find ways to provide, to allow myself to do books. I needed to do a book, design major, loved the passion of drawing, so books was the answer for me. It was that beautiful marriage.
Well, and it certainly shows in your work
Well,
how that developed and changed and matured over time, and that Mirandian Brother Wind is one of the most beautiful books.
I know, and there's something powerful about doing what you have to do to get to that point where you're doing what you love.
Exactly.
And so, the reward of that time was grit.
Yeah.
This ability to organize my life in a way that I could end up doing exactly what I love doing.
Well, let's talk about your style and process. When you decide to do a book, when you take on a project, what kind of research do you do before you dive in?
There's lots of research. If I talk about my work and I talk about energy, it first comes from the text itself. It has to somehow move me. And then the other piece to that is, of course, you mentioned, is the research, because the research can not only provide you what you need to make pictures, but it can also introduce you to that culture or to that subject. And out of that can grow and spring so many different things. It can actually, research could change the direction, the visual direction of a project. So research is my bridge to the subject. I was a kid growing up. I didn't understand what learning was about. I mean, how did it fit in my life? There was a world out there that was telling me I couldn't make pictures, that there was no space for me, right? So I didn't see school as a vehicle to go anywhere. It was a matter of getting through school. And then I was dyslexic, so I lagged far behind the students with reading and really concepts of big ideas. So that when I realized that the world was out there for me, that I had to find and devise a way of entering into that world, that was a powerful moment for me. So there's a sense, so I always say I'm playing catch up. So an editor might approach me and say to me, tell me what you want to do. What are you interested in? And I said, something I've never done before. Because that is that carrot for me to introduce myself to something that I'm not familiar with. So I've used the work as a kind of a spearhead or a learning process. I always say I'm playing catch up. We talk about subjects in terms of books, but I work for like the National Park Service or National Geographic magazine. Very difficult. Why? Because that's the learning process. The learning process about new subject is what the energy is. And that's why I can do it for 64 years. It's just that it's there. You're providing an interpretation of a text or an idea. But it's also about this sharing of where I am at any given time.
I don't know if you all sat in on the lecture next door, but Kate Messner talked about the power of curiosity. And this relates
about that. Yeah.
Directly to what you're talking
Right.
about. The desire to learn, the need to explore and to expand,
Right.
expand your life. When you decide to take on a project, do you have a master plan in mind from the beginning, or is this something that develops organically as you go through the text and as you alter and you edit the pictures? Do you see the big picture and then fill in the details, or do you just trust yourself and go with the flow?
Always starts the same. This book is going to be entirely different. I'm going to stretch do new ideas, and then I get, what is that? So I fall back on what I know, that comfort zone, and then I let the text of the story speak to me, and it will generate a direction. Now, I work in pencil and watercolor on paper. In a sense, that's my safety net, all right? I know how to do it. I love doing it, which allows me to take on different subjects. So, we talked about this, Marcia. It's poetry, it's fiction, it's nonfiction. So what I do is, the risk-taking for me most often is in the subject itself. In other words, it's this newness of a subject where I take the risk. So what I like best is not, and I'm a member of that concrete floor, watercolor and pencil and paper. But the other piece is that I've never experienced this subject before fully enough to interpret it. So the risk-taking is not knowing if I'm going to do it justice. So, and I need that in place. I need to have this sense is, can I do this
The
or
challenge.
not? It's the challenge.
It's
Yeah.
a way to challenge yourself.
Yeah, and I always wanted it to go away, by the way. I mean, I thought that there was a certain point in my career, after you've been doing it a while, that would go away. Now I realize it's just
It's part of the
energy.
process.
It's part of the process.
It's part of the process. And so you work also with, you work with models as part of this too.
Yes.
And some of it, but is that just a starting point for you and then you develop from there? Or how do you envision your characters?
It's interesting. Let's work backwards, I guess. Because I don't use models. Rarely do I use models now. I have these little artist mannequins, which are
A different
really,
kind of model.
Yeah, it's a different kind of model. So, and I can costume out of my head. So if I have the costumes and I have these little figures, I can hold them in my hand, and it part of the challenge is developing different perspectives and foreshortenings, which you kind of avoid earlier on, all those things. But before then, there was a use of models, but models in an interesting way. I never shoot. If there's two people having a conversation, rarely do I would photograph them together. Let me go back, because it's the first thing I do is the composition. In other words, you don't want to be in that place where the photograph dictates. So I do the compositions first in thumbnails and sketch form, and then I look for a supportive, reference, and whether that's bringing in a model or using these little model mannequins. And it went in the very beginning, and so we're sort of working back, because a lot of this has to do with the knowledge that you accrue as you go along. So in the very beginning, it was models, and I would have the models sort of act out different things, and I would costume them as closely as I could at the time. We actually had our own little costume. My wife, Gloria Jean, was assistant. And then, you learn from that. Bob Osanich, and this is a name that old-timers would know, back in the day, he photographed just for illustrators. And he had a studio downtown here in New York. So I shot about 3 or 4 things with him where he would do the props. He would build the props and whatnot. You want a boat, or you want whatever, he would find the kind of things. Black Cowboy, Wild Horses. He had it was this kind of a sort of half barrel with a saddle on it, that kind of thing. But I learned from him, So after a certain period of time, I would, I could make up anything with whatever, and I would find things around the house or in the garage that I would use.
Just as props.
As props,
really.
And you could build on that. And
Right,
it was kind of,
right.
but it was helpful to have, him, see how he worked.
Right.
And then so that was in the 70s and the 80s.
Yeah, so part of the early learning process.
Yeah, it was part of the learning process. And I also, by the way, I only worked from contact sheets, because contact sheets, just small little things, forced me to be more inventive.
Given the space that you
Yeah,
had?
so it was either contest trees or I shoot Polaroids, because I didn't want a full-scale image to work from. It forced me to be more inventive.
To focus and to...
Yeah, what I
and to
wanted to
develop
say,
the
what I was
extras.
trying to say, yes.
When you worked on some of these projects, do you, in my introduction, I talked about the secondary elements, and this is what I consider value added in a picture book. When you open the story and you see, in Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, you see two birds, each one carries a thread, and then a few pages later, you see that those threads are woven into a nest. Now, a kid is not going to see that on the first go-round, but there are many elements in your work that carry that second, third, fourth viewing, where you discover something that you hadn't noticed before. And I think that's a very powerful thing to include. One of my other favorite ones is in Little Red Riding Hood, after the wolf swallows Grandma, he's lying in the bed, and there's a portrait on the wall that's looking at him like this. So you didn't notice that the first time you read the story, but it's there when you go back and you have fun things to discover in the story. So is that something that develops as you create the story, or is that something that's always there in your imagination, or how do you add those value-added elements?
I think, the page turn as a designer, wearing the designer's hat, is always important, is, getting the reader to turn the page. But in building in that, because that's what I want you, because I'm interpreting the text, they're reading the text, they're reading the pictures. So I want them to have that dramatic sort of page turn. But the idea is that to do art, that the reader wants to go back. So if you go back that second time after you read the text, the words and the pictures, there's another story there. And that story is one of the things that I'm interested in, but it's also the backstory of the subject, the main subject, of the central characters. So my idea is there's a text. Visually, I'm interpreting the text, but I'm also telling another story. I'm going to introduce you to that world behind those central characters. So that's that. So you'll find that there's lots of points of interest.
Yes.
And most of those points of interest are things I'm interested in.
Well,
now,
it creates a universe, and
yeah.
I'm thinking also in the tortoise and the hare, all the frogs have their own little world going on. It's another story. It's
the environment responding to the subject, to the text. So everybody is, if you look at like Sam and the Tigers, and you look at the trees or the little animals that are running around, they're also responding to, that's a secondary story. They're responding to what's going on. So if there's a sense of tension, everybody's tense. The flowers are tense. The trees are tense. And that has a lot to do with keeping myself also active or invested in, you guys see me okay? Oh, I'm on the screen. You're right. I'm bigger than life there. I am a legend. I never said, I said I was going to an intensive workshop. But when I look at myself that size, I'm impressed. Yeah, I'm sorry.
No, it's part of the universe. Absolutely. All right. Well, we got sidetracked.
Yeah, I know.
I think let's talk about experimenting.
Yeah.
In terms of finding the balance between your signature style and doing things that push your comfort zone a bit. Are there expectations that you're working with, or do you just block those out? You're not paying attention to what librarians, teachers, editors, authors, does it have to speak to you? Is it something that you want to, I was thinking particularly of the Martin Luther King book,
Right.
which I've never seen you use handwritten labels and
Right.
information. And then I love the cut paper, the torn paper that's part of that. And is that something you were pushing yourself to do, or did it come naturally, or?
All right, you asked a lot of questions.
I'm a curious person.
I know. Let's see if I can go back and the first part is why. I mean, in terms of risk taking, how well watercolor. The beauty of watercolor is that it's. One would say you can't control it, or if you go into any library in terms of how-to books, you're going to find more on how to do watercolor than probably any other area. And so I like watercolor because I can't master it. I can use it and it can use me, but I can't master it. So I mean, I always have something in mind in terms of an outcome, but I know that it will change depending on a lot of other factors, the properties of the medium itself. I love that. So, so I feel myself always exploring the medium of watercolor. And I like the idea of being challenged by its so-called limitations. That I like, so that's the exploratory piece. The layering and not always knowing, or having something in mind that you can't get to, but on the way there you discover something else.
And are there times when you just get an artist block, or you're frustrated? Do you have to get up and run around the block for a while?
Well, there was those frozen moments, I think, earlier on, when I never thought that I could accomplish what the expectations, not only for myself but also for whoever I was working for. So that was always there. After 60 years, I've overcome that. Just recently, by the way. So there are all kinds of stuff that would have, in terms of been a block, when I was younger, that becomes an entry into some way of getting out of it. So having, let's say, those moments where you can't figure something out, it just means that I just have to take a deep breath and maybe doing something else that's related sometimes, maybe not so, that it will come back around.
Right,
so
right.
Ideas, for me, there's always an idea. It just depends on how long it takes to get there. It's always going to be there. And sometimes the harder it is to find the answer enriches the answer when you finally get there.
So you allow yourself the time
and
the opportunity to make those mistakes.
Yeah, and I can do that now. And I have the beauty of doing something for a long time. You have the history. So I know that now, that if it's I reach that point where there's that nothing's happening there, it's not happening for a reason. Earlier on, when deadlines, I got a great time. If I break out, it's only that. No, that's neither here nor there. If there, I always know that there's a powerful thing when the beauty of something is when you can't resolve it, because you can't find it and you can't resolve it. You dig deeper, and then you tend to. For me, I tend to have more original ideas that surprise myself when I don't have something in the beginning and I have to dig for it. So I'm saying that after a lot of years doing it. Step back, I would have been sweating. I wouldn't have been able to sleep. Now, interesting, you brought up a place to land, and I don't remember not being able to sleep until that, and recent until that book. And I didn't know, first of all, the history of that particular book for me was, the hesitancy of doing the civil rights movement because it was so well documented. And so I was searching for my contribution. How could I make that work? So you'll see the use of collage, which is different. You'll see the use of I've used collage before, but I would tear some edges, cut some edges. There you see them all torn for whatever reason, that was a need for me. I went to see a sleep doctor, and he was saying, do you sleep well? And I said, well, at times I don't sleep well. He says, the importance of sleep. You gotta, you gotta get those 8 hours. And I said, it's sometimes the most productive part of my day. The ideas flood out, and it is happening there. So now I'm balancing, when it's useful, when, the next day you're too foggy to be able to do anything. The idea is, for me, depends on what you do, your style. I need this sense of tension, that there's something to be mined in this project.
And let's move ahead to what happens once you turn in a project. What happens, what kind of relationship do you have in the back and forth with your editor, with the art director? I know you've worked very closely with Julius Lester. Did you have direct contact with him as opposed to the traditional, the author's here and the artist is here?
Yeah, with Julius Lester, we did about 9 projects together. That was a very unusual collaboration because we went, first of all, beyond the first 2 or 3 projects, we would have a phone call. And we had we'd arrive at a mutual interest, and then we would decide on a project. The retelling, adapting a Little Black Sambo, Black Cowboy, Wild Horses, all came out of conversations. Mm-hmm. And then he would supply a text, often to me first, before it would go to an editor. Then it would go to an editor. Now, we were working with Phyllis Fogelman, we had both worked with for a long period of time. And then there was an interesting thing. I would suggest to Julius about, visual tension that was important, that maybe wasn't thought about in terms of an author. And we would have a conversation, and Julius was a quick read. He would never do what you asked, but he would use that to develop an idea further. And then, so I was actually actively working with the text, shaping some of the text to fit the visual, my visual needs, which Julius really understood and respected. And then I got to a point, and I said, wait a minute, it's kind of lopsided. So I began to start sending Julius my sketches, so to comment. And that was rare that he commented, but he did. He had the opportunity to. So that was a very unique relationship. Yes. And so we felt, we would develop a project together. And I miss him, and I miss that working relationship.
But now an editor says to you, we have a project we think.
Yeah, but I still get involved with the text. Sometimes the annoyance of the author, but in the case of A Place to Land, it ended actually in the Oval Office, and I said, well, we got to look at this. And JFK was resistant to the march, and that there was a backlash to the march. So it didn't end in that arc of hope, like Martin's words. So we added 4 spreads, which was involved with me beginning to say, let's carry this a little further. And then Barry understood and would do that.
That's great. I think that is a tribute to your power also.
Yeah, I love making pictures, and I've been doing it long enough, and if my
they trust you.
Yeah, right, exactly. And then as an author, and not, it seems to me it makes sense as someone that says, you know what, this is a great text. My role, I can help you make it better. Just that, I mean, if it is a picture book, then we do need that
That
marriage.
cooperation.
Yeah, so,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely. Have you had times when you've disagreed with the direction project? Do you negotiate that, or do you try and just work through it?
I have to respect the authors and the editors. You mentioned earlier, and I didn't answer, and that is, even in the case of A Place to Land, where I didn't really have the developed sketches and thumbnails and sketches and dummy book like other books required, I keep the editor and the art director always abreast of what's happening. So there's no surprises from their point of view. They know what they're getting. Yes, is there a disagreement? If I feel strongly about something, I go ahead and do it. But I have to have that open ear to saying, wait a minute, they have a point here, or it's a point to be considered.
Right.
Whether I reject it or keep it, it's still, the idea is a book should grow. The collaboration should make it better, even if there's disagreement. There could be some richness to be mined there.
I think we're about to wrap up, so I think we would like to say, what is your advice for illustrators starting in children's books today? That's a trick question.
Yeah, I know, but it's really developed this
Go with your
sense
heart.
of interest and develop this interest, curiosity. Stay curious, stay open, find that medium that you love, and I draw almost every day. So a sketchbook, yeah, I guess that. But the curiosity, you've got to be curious about. You got to be curious about life in the industry itself. Learn about production. Learn about design. Learn about promotion. Every aspect makes a good book. So it doesn't just stop with your ability, your gifts, your talent. It has to be an understanding. The audience is there, present. That's intuitive for me. I don't write for kids, but I know I have the certain skills inside to be able to do that. That's there. But learn as much as possible. Everything has value. And you want to, and by the way, you want to have that everything has value. You want to bring it home to yourself, that you have value. The marks you make have value. Somewhere it has a value. Whether you learn from it or you surprise yourself, it has its own unique value. So.
And you are the only person who can tell that story.
That's true. Yeah, that's very true. Right. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Paul, how are we doing with time? 16 seconds.
We'll now
Thank
do
you.
a little dance for all of you.
So we ended a bit early.
Well, thank you both.
You're welcome.
Wow. So why don't you stay where you are?
Yeah.
Wow. By the way, you both have very melodic voices, right?
And it's in the morning too. Well,
Yeah. This is really like a master class, isn't it? If you think about the way the industry, the children's books represent society and the world and what's happening in the world with availability of technologies and also how society works, and to hear how that informed your art and challenged you. I'm verklempt right now, but anyway, we're now going to talk about process. We're going to get more into the nitty-gritty of process. So I'll tell you when we can pull that up. I'm just going to do this because we're going to jump right in. And so we're going to kind of go deeper and go into specific books and talk about whatever you want to share with us about the process of the books that we're going to look at, and applying a lot of. Okay, we can go to the slideshow now. applying what, excuse me, what you were just talking about before. This is you at work. We're going to get to see you at work in person later.
Right.
So tell us about this book and how you started this process of this magnificent, that's the cover, by the way. The art needs no type. That is the cover of the book. And you can probably, well, you'll hear what the book is.
Well,
Can you see
this,
the
of course, is the Lion and the Mouse. That is, I put that together because I wanted to talk about the research. Marcia, you brought up the research, and it really is extensive. My library, I know I have over 3,000 books. In the area of like African American history and culture, and wild and nature itself, I have probably more books than most small libraries. So I just wanted to, wanted to talk about that extensive research. And I also started with the Lion and the Mouse using sort of stuffed animals as also, again, you could hold those in your hand and whatnot. But again, that's the mouse. So you see, going through my own, in most cases, it's from my own library. Now the library is huge because we have the internet. But at this time, and I tend to go through my own books first. There's something about holding a book that you know in your hand. The Lion and the Mouse started, I think I had done a collection of Aesop's fables in the year 2000, and then it was just one illustration. There's 126 fables or something like that. So each fable had a full-color illustration, sometimes a vignette, and sometimes a full page. And the Lion and the Mouse was a fable that I remembered as a kid. The majestic lion, and so I decided that I wanted to. The lion needed more space. The Lion and the Mouse. So. On a trip coming back from somewhere, I developed a series of thumbnails. I think the next slide, maybe. Yeah, I was on a plane, and the idea of the Lion and the Mouse, which is wordless, was that I would do a sort of a storyboard because I knew the story so well, and then I would add text later. Well, once I finished these sketches, this storyboard, I realized the pictures were telling the story itself. So I took that idea to my editor. We agreed it could be wordless. Could we go back to the?
Sure.
I couldn't leave it alone.
Did you picture the cover also as wordless right from the beginning? Because that is one of the most powerful images.
This is an interesting thing because I would love to have said how hard I fought for that cover. It was. There might be a series of cover. No, we don't have it. Okay.
Now.
Okay. So I started with the idea of of the fact lion, a picture, mouse, a picture, and then maybe an ampersand or something like that. That we didn't need. We didn't need either the credit. I started doing without a credit, illustrated by Jerry Pinkney, without the Lion and the Mouse, and I finally resolved it got to the point where I thought I was right on, where it was the picture of a lion, the picture of the mouse, and when I took it share it with my editor and art director, they came up with the fact that since it's a wordless book. And we were down to a creditless, titleless cover. That why don't we just have the lion on the front cover
and the lion on the front cover tells you with his eyes.
Yeah.
To turn the book over to see the mouse. Otherwise, you wouldn't know that this was the Lion and the Mouse.
The cover is on your handouts, by the way.
That was interesting because there's certainly not the first, titleless credit cover. However, you don't know what's going on. It doesn't suggest Puss in Boots. As you know, it's Puss in Boots. But in this case, you don't know the lion. This is what's inside. And that was a kind of a risk-taking, I think, on the part of the publisher.
They're saying trust the reader.
Yeah, exactly. So that's a working drawing, and you can see that those working drawings are marker on vellum at this point, and they're pretty exact. Although it's always changing. You see the position of the mouse changes from, you know, and these changes happen when I'm on the light box and I'm transferring from the sketch to the finished pencil drawing.
So, and speaking of, your materials, because how many of you work in traditional media?
Oh.
Wow.
Yeah, that's
most
beautiful.
Of you. So raise
maybe that's why you're here, though. Yeah.
And how many of you work purely digital, never anything on paper, only on like a Cintiq or, okay. Yeah. And how many of you mix, like will scan in elements and, okay.
Yeah.
So, what are your materials and when you
it's
start?
It's pencil, watercolor, and paper. I've been working with a marker on the vellum now, and I actually.
So that's marker?
Yeah, marker on vellum, and I actually revise. I'm continually revising and changing as I go along. So I wanted the whole process to be active. Yeah.
So it is like sculpture. You're sculpting as you go.
Yeah, exactly. And you're learning as you go on. This is the research for the trap. I wanted
I'll show you the trap. There's the trap.
Yeah. So I wanted oftentimes it's been illustrated many times, and there's a net that's thrown over the lion. And I wanted some more, again, that visual tension. I wanted to figure out, I wanted him to be up high, and then when the mouse would chew through the netting, that would be the dramatic fall. So this is what looking up traps, different traps, and then how the weight of a lion would affect the net. So you see that process. And then I created my own. I like that. That's a trap for an alligators. And then I like the spring trap too. And so I sort of invented my own. But I always have to have something. I kind of, I feel that it should come from a source. So I invent, but at the same time, there's something that I'm looking at. And again, that is, I think, keeping myself interested. Okay, because you pick up stuff, you learn about traps, whatever, who knows whether you'll use it again. So you can see the kind of, in a sense, I hint at a pulley and, a trap, a trip wire, and then the lion would go up in the air. So
it really, you're able to get across these are still images, but it's cinematic in that it feels like it's in motion. The energy is so real because of that tension. And I love from your conversation talking about the backstory.
Yeah.
Look at that monkey.
We have
it's always,
and
so
he's commenting.
Every element plays.
Like, whoa.
Yeah, I
say,
know.
oh, it's about time.
Yeah, right. So everybody's reading the story. Even the characters in the story is reading it. The other thing is, if you look closely at my original art, you also see a lot of the pencil working, and I also sometimes there's a shadow of when I change something, I leave that shadow there because that, again, sense of life and energy. I'm still looking at that person who's telling that story to me. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so talk a bit about how you approach, like for the example, for this composition, because you said you are using, and I love how you talked about the contact sheets or Polaroids, because often what we often do, if we have models, often ourselves, because now we can just take a selfie.
Yeah.
How many of you have done that? Okay. So it's easy to print that out at actual size and trace it as your structure, because I know people, that's a way of learning. But the fact that you make it so small, or when you use reference, and then you have to fill it in. So for example, you did not have a lion in your studio in a net. How did you approach the composition, the energy of this piece?
That stuff, that animal in the beginning. Now, by the way, I'm using taxidermy mounts. But
you didn't have a lion, though.
No, I just took that stuffed toy, and you can manipulate it, and then remember how you manipulate it, and then that's what you operate from. So the idea is that you're constantly inventing. But this gets us back to why that safety net also at times is the pencil and watercolor and paper, because I know I can achieve that. So it allows me to start playing with other aspects, like composition, things like that. But that's also the designer in me as well. because you're moving elements around.
Is it the quote, people say it's Picasso, I'll just say it is, he was at a big dinner, lots of people, expensive restaurant. He said, I'll take care of dinner. He did a sketch on a napkin and said, that's paying for this $5,000 meal because he was Picasso. And someone at the table said, but that took you 30 seconds. And he said, no, that took me 30 years.
Yeah,
and that reminds me of what you were saying.
Yeah.
So this is not how you started out, being able to do this.
No.
So it's the hard work. I mean, this is great to hear because, and the way you're talking about the last part of your process, recently you're still challenging yourself. So we will get to that book right now, A Place to Land. The process for this you talked a little bit about. Let's get back a little bit into the research, because you do, with The Lion and the Mouse, it's in your imagination,
right,
based on a lion and a mouse and the folktale, fable. With this, it's nonfiction based on reality. So
right.
How do you take real people and make them your own?
Well, I mean, it's interesting. Let me comment on this photograph because it kind of relates to something Marcia and I talked about. This was a photograph of Dr. King, and they're wearing these Hawaiian leis. And this is why I go to books first. And I found this picture, and this happened after the march, so it really didn't have very little to do with the march itself, except that I couldn't get it out of my imagination. Why were they wearing the Hawaiian leis? And so eventually, I think I was trying to stretch, or but this time period was so well documented in photographs. So I kept pushing that in my head back, and then I just decided to look up the Hawaiian leis, and it was a symbol of love. And Dr. King and some of the marchers they've worn them a couple times to speak to this idea of love in the face of hatred. And by the way, this eventually was included in the pages that we added. So that's why I keep thinking, the researchers also can change the direction and add things to a particular project. So, you can see me now. Now, there's only one. There's two images where we actually got permission. Everything else is invented with, using lots of different multiple photographs. Here you can see me developing this Pettus Bridge march. These are pencil, watercolor, and paper, and you can see I start with like a light sepia, and then the idea is that even my sketches is a form of making art. So rather than when I used to work with pencil and paper, and I would do tracing, and this way I wanted it to speak to the process itself, and it also provided me with a sense of energy. So I revise on the same drawing, on the same sketch. You can see with the darker marker over the original, sort of sketching, and these compositions are developed as I go along. This is really quite different than my approach to any other process.
I love to hear that.
There you can see it developing further, and this is a second one, a sketch where I'm beginning to define it more, add characters, but you can see in some areas where the hands you may see a number of different approaches to how the hands should be, what they should be doing, and the idea of doing it as it's sculpting. You said, Laurent, you said it. That's like sculpting. You're changing and you're developing as you go along, and in the process of developing and going further to the actual watercolor paper, that actually changes. So, and you're being informed by your own marks.
And as Marcia pointed out, with the torn paper and the collage aspect, talk a bit about when do you put that in there?
That comes, in this case, it was the idea of that, knowing that I was going to use music sheets. That came later. That's the last piece. You'll see in my keynote the process. Sometimes it comes earlier, sometimes it comes later. I love the idea of, and by the way, I mention this again, often when I've used collage, I either use an X-Acto knife or scissors, and then I tear it. For some reason, I don't know why, tearing was important to this book. And I think it was I wanted this to be urgent. You know, I wanted to feel alive in the present. So tearing seemed to do that. Tearing seemed to leave things unfinished, a rugged edge. The time, no one knew what was going to happen during that time. Everything was urgent. And so I wanted to find a visual way to do that. And so I wanted to feel that I didn't know what was going to happen. So tearing, and then getting an idea of where it should be, and then applying the rice glue and putting it down. And the first response always, it was in the wrong place. But I couldn't pick it up again, or rarely. But I wanted it. In other words, what I wanted to happen was that I had the same involvement, the same kind of risk-taking visually in interpreting that time.
It brings up the spontaneity of it, too.
It had to be part of that. I had to take on a visual role of people who were anxious. They didn't know how, but there was this sense of spirit, of camaraderie, and this pulling together and yet not knowing. And so the artwork had to be just all those pieces. It had to be in the not knowing.
This is a master class, isn't it? Because it shows it's not art. People think of often art, you create art as art technique, like what medium am I going to use? There's a heart and soul that dictates the mediums, and the way you use them is what it sounds like.
Yeah, it's the way I make my pictures. And that's also kind of key to all of this, is that every one of you will have your own way of making an image. So this is just my investment, and I need that for a variety of reasons. I need that kind of investment. I need that sort of sense that it comes down to just, when I'm finished, I want to believe that I created something that's new to me, that speaks to something else. And earlier on, it was developing a style and a way of approaching that I felt was, I don't know, like a car finish, that it was perfect, that it met all the visual sort of standards. Now, I care less about that. I'm going to tell you something very interesting. In A Place to Land, I've been doing this for a long time, you know that. In A Place to Land, I said, my art making has to sit back and serve the text. It had nothing to do with composition. I knew that would come, but it had to be nothing to do with making pretty pictures or great compositions. That had to take a back seat. Interesting enough, the response to it is that, wow, you're making art. But maybe that's what art is. Maybe you don't start out making art. You start out making something. And the hope and in the making of it, and the investment of it, you do make art.
Wow. We have 5 minutes left for this, so I'm going to skip through these. You can look at these lovely process slides for talking about cut paper and rip paper. But let's talk about a new book you have coming out, which is you've written and illustrated.
Yes.
And what was your process for, and I'll just go through slides as you talk about it, for this book, because I think it's a very important book, and it's beautiful.
We wanted to do a book. Someone says, you water kind of images well. So we were looking for a project to sort of demonstrate this idea of the love and passion for painting water, even though it's one of the most difficult things to do. But that's the beauty of it as well. So we looked for and we found, of course, we ended up really with the Little Mermaid. And, but we knew that had some, I mean, even though it's really stayed in our imaginations, we had some challenges there with the prince and how he treated the mermaid and things like that. So I started with, so I did 100, I counted these, it's important, because I use it for the authors, 140 thumbnail drawings. We'll go, this is a dummy book.
This is a dummy.
And I did the visuals first. In other words, I took the Hans Christian Andersen text and I pulled out sort of what you call visual beats, visual images that impressed me, and then I would knit them together into a visual story without any text. And then I would go back and I wrote the text based on the things that she loses, the mermaid loses her voice, there's a sea witch, and there's all those things. So I knitted that into a story, and then I wrote the text. And so it's very, those are the thumbnails. I did like 140 of these over. And these were just, again, visual sort of, they come down to new things, beats, visual kind of steps or pieces that I liked about the original story.
How big is this?
Those are probably about 3 inches by 4 inches or something like that, 2 by 4 inches.
This is not to actual size.
Yeah, right, exactly. And these are marker on paper, and it was, again, it was a direct response to the kind of visual kind of imagery that was so magical in the Little Mermaid.
And is this a quick
Yeah, these
process?
are notes, 5 minutes, I guess, whatever it takes, It was like, how many different ways can you see this particular scene, that kind of thing. I'll talk about it a little later. I did a project called Studio as Muse, and it was the idea of making a mark and seeing where the mark goes. And then and that mark would create another idea. So this is this is the new Pinkney in the way I'm working, and that is you find what you want to do, and then you do it, and you just keep doing it and doing it and doing it, and the value is in the redoing. This would be a working a drawing that before I go to doing the finished drawing. These are the size I'm going to create the art. A marker on vellum. Yeah. And
then use a light board.
Yeah, light box, and then I transfer, always constantly, evolving and developing. I should say, developing the visual.
And
so,
because this also is invented, unlike the previous two books we looked at.
Well, that's the beauty.
This is
yeah.
really your imagination.
If you want to, if Pinkney has a sort of a philosophy about it, it's that what I try to do is that each project should be that different from the last one, so you're entering into a new landscape. So the new landscape creates the energy, and this is the energy that I need. I'm unsettled in my, and my approach to how I see the day. So the unsettledness is also the new idea, the new subject brings me down. This is a calming device for me because I'm in a space where I can find a positive way of using the energy that's brewing inside. So what I do with it, so you find a subject that's going to challenge that, and then it settles you down.
Wow, and next we're going to see this in action. So that is the time we have for this. So first I want to thank you for this process.
Yeah.